If you're anything like me, you leave a shoot with way too much footage. I find that I end up shooting more footage than I can ever use, and a bunch of it doesn't end up being terrible either. So how do I sort through all of that footage in post-production? I make a selects timeline. Today I'm going to cover the importance of making a selects timeline and walk you through my methodology. Welcome to Smartphone Storytellers, where I share all the tips and techniques that equip you to create storytelling videos using the smartphone that you already own. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, as I've got some pretty cool things planned. First things first, what is a selects timeline? A selects timeline is literally just a timeline that contains all of your best shots. When you go out to film, you're going to frame up the perfect shot and get ready to capture it. But how often do you hit record and then suddenly the moment's gone? The problem is you've already got that shot sitting in your collection. It's too dangerous to go and delete it as you lose valuable filming time and you run the risk of accidentally deleting a clip that you actually want to keep. So there it just sits, messing up the organization of all of the rest of your footage. Or let's just say you've got a beautiful shot, but it's really only the middle 10 to 15 seconds of a 25-second clip that is something you're going to want to use. A selects timeline means that you've got the best portion of that footage ready at your fingertips for when you need to drop it into an edit. A selects timeline has two main uses. As we've covered, it lets you weed through the not so good shots and get rid of them, but it also saves you time down the line. For example, if you've told a story of an outreach that you held in February and you captured a bunch of great footage, you may want to pull from that footage for an end of year recap video. When you sort through all the footage for a project, all of the organization of that project ends up just sitting in the project file, and it makes it harder to pull from in the future because you've either got to sort through all that footage again to find the good pieces, or you need to end up pulling from your final export of this project, which means that it might not have a long enough clip for you to pull for your new edit. When you make a selects timeline though, you can export the full timeline and archive it away. That way, when you're working on that end of year recap that we talked about, you can just pull in the selects timeline and suddenly you've got a whole string of clips that are worth using. So what are the ground rules for making a proper selects timeline? Let's dig into the details of how I make my selects timelines and archive them for future use. First, how do I cut my selects timeline? I typically end up dropping all of my footage into a single timeline. You're going to want to make sure whatever editor you're using gives you a timeline that's the same resolution and frame rate as the footage that you're using, which is the default for most editors. If you're using high frame rate footage that you want to conform into slow motion, you can use the frame rate that you'll be editing your final project in and conform the footage to that speed. That's a topic I plan to cover at a later date, but if you're curious now on how to conform footage to a different frame rate, there's tons of videos discussing this idea. Once I have all of my footage in a timeline, now comes the monotonous part. I scrub through all of the footage and cut out the portions that are downright bad to unusable. You're not trying to trim the footage to make it snappy or high energy, just trying to weed out the portions that you might use in an edit. So you're cutting out the shots that didn't work out, the moments that you bumped the camera, the times you accidentally missed hitting record, and then walked around for 30 seconds looking for your next shot. Not that I ever do that. When making these cuts, I typically like to leave a little bit more on either side of the clip, so that I have some buffer. You can always trim the footage back later, but you can't add footage back that you cut out. Once I've gotten all the shots trimmed up and have only the footage that I might use in an edit, I go ahead and organize it all. This is completely arbitrary and based on whatever makes sense to you. For instance, I frequently film footage of services at churches. I grab footage of pre-service, during the service, the kids area, and whatever else they might want me to capture. I don't always film all of those sections back to back all at once though. As a result, it's all out of order. In my selects timeline, I go ahead and put all the shots with similar themes all together. That way when I'm editing and pulling from selects, I know that all my worship footage is together, or all my meet and greet pre-service type footage is together. I also get rid of any gaps between footage, so it's just a constant flow of footage. One other thing I like to do is put a slate up front. A slate is just a still image at the start of footage that explains technical details to anyone who needs to use the footage. It's a similar idea to the slate that they hold up before a shot in Hollywood. I don't always film on the same types of cameras or at the same frame rate, so I want to make it clear to myself in the future. The slate's going to contain whatever information you think is going to be helpful, but here's what I typically like to include. Which camera I'm filming on. The frame rate I'm shooting at. If I conformed the footage, what did I conform it to? Any changes I made to the color grade beyond subtle adjustments, usually just saying what LUT I used. This doesn't need to be fancy. It's just there so that 6 months from now you can recall the details about the footage in case you need to change anything to use it in your project. Speaking of color grade adjustments, you don't necessarily want to heavily stylize your footage similarly to how you tweak it in your edit. For instance, if you're editing a project where you want to give your footage a more vintage feeling and you're tweaking it that way in editing, you don't want to do the same thing to your selects footage. You want to keep it as neutral as possible so you're free to make tweaks to it in your future without being backed into any specific looks. You also don't want to add any fades, transitions, or anything else that you can't edit out in the future. Once you've sorted through all the footage, all that's left is the export. I typically make my initial selects timeline within the project I'm using the footage in, so I can just natively pull shots as needed from one timeline to the next, but you want to make an export of it so you can pull from it in the future. You want this export to be as high quality as you can, aiming to match whatever format your initial footage was shot at. So for instance, if you shot 4K ProRes on your smartphone, you'd want it to export a 4K ProRes sequence at the same quality. If you can't match the exact file format, go for the highest quality you can so you have minimal data loss. This all will depend on the editing platform that you're using as well as the options available. Once that's done, go ahead and archive it somewhere so you can grab it again in the future. If you're storing it on your phone, make a folder in your photos that's called Event Selects, so you have them all together. Or if you're archiving to Dropbox or some other cloud platform, make a folder in there that will make it easy to find the footage again. That's it. It's nothing fancy in the end, but it gives you an easy way to grab B-roll footage in the future and pull from it as needed without needing to go back to the source. This has saved me so many hours of work as I've had to pull from older footage for clients in order to tell stories. This allows you to save your future self time while keeping your project organized as you tell your story. Make sure you select the subscribe button and drop a like so you can stay connected and continue to get great content that helps you to tell stories. Remember though, ultimately it's not the gear that matters, it's the story.